People barely looked at the black single dad in seat 12F. Some passengers stepped around him. Others pretended he wasn't there at all. He sat quietly beside the window of the Boeing 737, holding a folded photo he kept hidden from view, trying to ignore the whispers that made the air feel colder than the cabin itself. But everything changed the moment the cockpit door opened. The pilots paused mid-step, their eyes locked on him. And when they heard the call sign he thought he'd left behind forever, they straightened, lifted their hands in a sharp salute, leaving the entire cabin frozen in confusion. Before he ever stepped onto the aircraft operated by Delta Airlines, the black single dad everyone would soon be whispering about had lived a life built on discipline, routine, and quiet sacrifice. Most mornings began before dawn, with him packing a small lunch for his daughter and preparing for another long shift at the training facility where he worked behind the scenes, far from the recognition he once received. To the neighbors in his modest complex near Atlanta, he was simply the calm guy who kept to himself, someone who didn't talk much but always held the door for others. This flight wasn't meant to be dramatic. It was supposed to be a simple trip, one he had delayed twice already, so he could finally attend a ceremony at the Naval Air Station Pensacola, where a group of young trainees he'd mentored would be receiving their wings. He carried no medals, no visible markers of who he had once been, just a worn duffel bag, a fading photograph, and the quiet heaviness of memories he rarely spoke about. But the moment he boarded, things shifted. Passengers filled the aisle with impatience, squeezing past him as if he were an obstacle rather than a person. A few even exchanged glances, as if his place in seat 12F somehow didn't fit the image they expected. He said nothing. He never did. He simply settled into the narrow seat, hands resting on the armrests, eyes fixed on the clouds gathering outside the window. What no one knew was that the identity they were dismissing so easily was the same one that had once commanded respect across entire runways. As the plane taxied away from the gate, the dad in seat 12F kept his gaze steady on the tarmac, breathing slowly, grounding himself in the familiar hum beneath the cabin floor. He had been on countless flights before, though never as a passenger, with a life that felt so far removed from the one he once lived. The crew moved through their routine, giving safety instructions he listened to out of habit more than necessity. Behind him, a couple whispered about their beach vacation. Across the aisle, a businessman tapped impatiently on a tablet made by Lenovo, huffing whenever the dad shifted even slightly in his seat. It wasn't open hostility, just the quiet kind, the subtle dismissal that settles over someone who looks different, who doesn't match the expectations of those around him. When a flight attendant passed by offering drinks, she asked every row around him if they needed anything, but skipped his row entirely. A small oversight, maybe, but one he had grown used to. He simply straightened his posture, adjusted the sleeve of his jacket, and continued to focus on the passing clouds as the aircraft ascended. It wasn't until the plane reached cruising altitude that things took a sharper turn. A teenager 2 rows behind him opened a glossy aviation magazine featuring the Air Force Special Operations Command and excitedly pointed to photos of sleek aircraft. His father leaned over and chuckled, telling him stories about real heroes who flew missions around the world. The dad in 12F heard every word, his jaw tightening slightly, not from offense, but from the weight of memories pressing against the walls of his mind. Then came the part he had been dreading. A turbulence warning chimed overhead, and passengers immediately turned restless. One woman clutched her seat as the cabin shook lightly. Another man muttered complaints about the flight crews on the plane operated by SkyWest Airlines. Anxiety spread quickly through the cabin. and amid the low murmurs, someone asked aloud why the pilots weren't doing more. The dad's training kicked in instantly, not visibly, not outwardly, but in his mind he was scanning scenarios, analyzing wind shear patterns, and recalling protocols that had saved lives more times than he could count. Yet he stayed silent. He was no longer in a cockpit. He was just a man in seat 12F. But fate has a way of forcing the past into the present. A sharp jolt rattled the plane, causing the overhead bins to tremble. Gasps filled the air. Passengers gripped their armrests. And then, unexpectedly, the intercom crackled with interference. The sound itself wasn't alarming, but the static-laced distortion contained a faint fragment of something only he recognized. A call sign, one he hadn't heard in years. He froze. It wasn't spoken clearly. It wasn't meant for the cabin. It was exchanged between the pilots, an internal communication that had leaked into the intercom for barely a second. But the impact hit him like a force of gravity. He blinked slowly, trying to steady his breath. Somewhere in that cockpit sat someone who knew exactly who he was, or someone who believed the legend of who he used to be. Around him, the passengers remained preoccupied with their fear, their judgments, their disinterest in the quiet man beside the window. But the tide had already shifted. The past he'd tried to leave behind was calling him again, and this time the entire cabin would witness what happened next. The next jolt wasn't violent, but it was sharp enough to pull every passenger into a tense, breathless silence. The cabin lights flickered. Someone gasped, another whispered a prayer. And then the intercom clicked on again, this time with clarity that cut straight through the thick air. A calm, steady voice from the cockpit spoke a single phrase the dad in seat 12F knew better than his own name. It was the call sign he had carried through some of the most dangerous missions of his life, one that had once echoed through the halls of Joint Special Operations Command. Hearing it now felt unreal, as if the past had stepped directly into the narrow aisle this commercial cabin. Passengers looked around in confusion. They didn't understand its weight, its history, or why the quiet man in seat 12F suddenly inhaled as if the world had tilted beneath him. His fingers tightened around the photo in his hand, the same one taken during his time training crews at Hurlburt Field, back when his uniform carried a name that meant something to thousands. A flight attendant hurried down the aisle, her face pale. She stopped at his row, glanced at her notes, then at him. "Sir, the captain is requesting your presence." Whispers rippled instantly across the cabin. Why him? Who was he? Why would the captain call a random passenger during turbulence? He rose slowly, every movement deliberate, steady, grounded in the muscle memory of a life he had kept hidden. As he stepped into the aisle, the aircraft shook again, causing several passengers to grab at seats or reach out reflexively. But he didn't waver. His posture, his composure, the quiet authority in his stride, all betrayed a truth the others had failed to see. By the time he reached the cockpit door, the entire cabin watched with wide, uncertain eyes. The door opened. Inside, the two pilots, veterans who had studied legends long before earning their wings, rose from their seats. Their faces were filled with recognition, awe, and disbelief. And then, with crisp precision, they saluted the man everyone else had ignored. The salute lingered longer than anyone expected. Passengers stared, mouths slightly open, the weight of the moment pressing down like the hum of the engines beneath them. In that instant, the black single dad in seat 12F was no longer invisible. The man they had dismissed, the one whose presence had gone unnoticed and unacknowledged for so long, now carried the undeniable authority of a life shaped by courage, discipline, and service. He returned to his seat, calm but altered, and for the first time that day he allowed himself a quiet exhale. The murmurs around him shifted from confusion to curiosity, from judgment to respect. Some passengers shot glances of apology. Others simply sat in awe, unsure of what they had witnessed. The turbulence outside seemed trivial compared to the upheaval of assumptions and biases in that cabin. The photo in his hand caught the light once more, a reminder of battles fought quietly, away from the eyes of the world. It wasn't just a symbol of past achievements. It was evidence that respect cannot be assumed, and recognition cannot always be earned in the ways society expects.